Hi, everyone. Welcome in. Looks like we're at 11, so we'll go ahead and get started here. My name is Charlotte Stowe. I am the research assistant for the Bright Spots Mini Lab. We're so excited that you're joining us today for this session. This will be our final session of the fall semester, but certainly more to come in the spring. Um, and before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to say that while we're gathered virtually, it is still important to acknowledge that our institutions are situated on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. Here in Minnesota, we're gathering on the land of the Dakota. Minnesota comes from the Dakota name for this region, Minnesota Makoche, which means the land where the waters reflect the skies. We're taking this moment to consider their histories, languages, and cultures. We invite you to do the same wherever you're joining in from. Then just a quick note about our funding here. The mini lab is co-sponsored by the Leadership Education and Training Program in MCH Nutrition and the Center for Leadership Education in Maternal and Child Public Health. Both are funded by HRSA's Maternal and Child Health Bureau, and we're grateful that these grants provide us with the opportunity to come together today around qualitative research. Next, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Michael Beckstrand. Michael serves as the Qualitative and Mixed Methods Research Associate at the University of Minnesota's Liberal Arts Technologies and Innovation Services, which is CLA's Research and Teaching Support Office. From there, he engages in collaboration and consultation on a diverse range of social behavioral science research methods across the university. In this role, he has served as contributing author on projects ranging from mass communication to public health, educational leadership to speech pathology and feeding concerns. Michael completed his PhD in political science from Syracuse's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs in 2015. He also attended the Consortium for Qualitative Research Methods Institute for Qualitative and Multi-Method Research. Please welcome Michael. I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I'm happy to be here with you all today. Give me one moment as I begin sharing my slides. The other word, I guess, that will be of relevance today is that I am a uh, AI skeptic enthusiast, if those things make any sense, in that I am potentially excited about where these tools and technologies are leading us, but I hope to be balanced in how I'm presenting some of this information and not too much proselytizing on how the magic box will save us all. With that said, let's start in. And so my idea for our time here today is that we'll have some context about how generative AI can engage in research practice writ general, and then talk briefly, since we are here situated at the University of Minnesota, about some of the thoughts around generative AI policy, specifically in regard to research. We'll then start moving directly into the qualitative analysis components of this and making sure we're at least using some common language and framing about how we think about doing qualitative meaning making and sense making. And before bringing in different ways that we can work with AI tools, from general purpose chatbots to having a specific analysis framework with your engagement of how you're purposefully using AI perhaps in qualitative work, and then looking at sort of the legacy tools of qualitative analysis, data analysis software, I should say, and how they have started to bring in AI into those spaces. And lastly, we should have time to briefly talk about how I have found the biggest use and time saving in my work in using automated transcription tools. So that's sort of the general plan for our conversation here today. So when I'm talking about AI, specifically, we are thinking about this sort of generative AI as a catch-all phrase, and we're thinking about a computer technology that is producing some sort of novel output, and that is distinct from what we typically think of as machine learning, which tends to be labor and time intensive on the person doing the machine learning or helping the computer to do that learning. A lot of this generative AI, that task has already occurred and is separated, right? And so we're talking about these large language models in generally in the space of these chatbots. ChatGPT obviously being the most famous or commonly used. But in the University of Minnesota context, we're talking about what is now called Gemini, which briefly was called Bard, and in Microsoft, which was Bing AI and now is called Copilot. And those are the things that the University of Minnesota specifically has data agreements and licensing agreements with working there. The other main player in this space that you may have engaged with or dealt with is Claude by the company called Anthropic. Behind these chatbots and web interfaces that we might be engaging with or trying, there are language models that have been trained on other data, usually drawn from the internet, perhaps in somewhat questionable ways. We're leaving that to the lawyers, but those models have been continually trained on how different words relate to each other and how different ideas relate to each other. And so the generative nature of this means it's predicting what words make sense going together as it creates new content or new images or other things of that nature. It is useful to say this space is changing insanely quickly. I have been sort of, experimenting with qualitative research in this space since the university engaged with Copilot and before that. And so in the way that it has improved in this short amount of time is quite breathtaking. And so that can get people very hyped and can get people very nervous, but it is changing quickly. And so each time we talk about this, the talks tend to be slightly different because the technology has changed under our feet. And so part of what that means is we need to highlight and focus on being critical and literate with what we're doing here. And so understand that underneath this, we are dealing with computational mathematical models that are making their best guess at what we expect to see. And that is the underlying technology here until that changes. We should be always checking still for accuracy and bias because these models have been trained on human data that was inherently biased and not selected for its lack of bias or its balance in any way, shape, or form. And so some of those inherent structures are baked into our data. We need to be responsible then in our use as we're considering those and checking for accuracy, that we are keeping ourselves in the loop and we are co-creating at the very least, because we take responsibility for what is happening through this new technological mediation of our thoughts and ideas. We should be communicating effectively and clearly about where and how we have used these kinds of tools, and we should not totally sidebar any ethical implications of the work. And so this sort of critical literacy is at the background of how I'm talking about this. I hope it is clear throughout, and happy to take comments afterwards if any of that lacks as we are talking about this here today. One other thing I do want to think about is that when we're talking about how AI can be used, in qualitative research, we should think about the entirety of the research process. At least for myself and with other people I have spoken with, often our brains immediately jump to analysis. Qualitative analysis seems to be the part that takes the most time or is the most complicated or the most difficult. And so our brains jump to, can this new tool make that process easier? I would argue it's more useful to think of where do these new tools help make the entire research process easier, and maybe easing the burden in certain parts of the research lifecycle makes us have more human time for doing the meaning-making, sense-making, qualitative analysis portion of the process. But that might be getting ahead of myself. So we should think about the entire process. Can these tools help us engage with our research planning, our topic definition, how we develop our research questions and data collection strategies in our research design, how we actually do that data collection, perhaps, how we analyze that data, or how we might visualize and report out the findings. So where can these new technologies possibly engage throughout? I would argue there are products and platforms and tools that do engage in different parts of this process. And we're not going to have time to talk about all of them in our couple hours together here today. But there are specific tools that are currently exhibiting in a copyright and legal licensing gray space that help you do literature reviews and literature searches. Research Rabbit, Elicit, Cite are some of those tools that help you find and pull out different topics or trace the bibliography of articles that you find particularly useful and pull those things in. We can There are tools like Chat PDF that specifically let you chat with a research document. Notebook LM, offered through the university, as we'll talk about, lets you sort of engage in specific documents as well. And that might help with that idea generation, synthesis, and topic definition before you get into data collection or analysis. The generative chatbots can be useful in analysis, and we're going to spend a decent chunk of today trying to interrogate where and when and how and if that is actually useful for us. And that is where the sort of legacy qualitative analysis tools, NVivo, Atlas TI, MaxQDA, have really doubled down and tried to engage with generative AI to help with that meaning making, segmentation, labeling, categorization task that we do with qualitative coding. And so that's going to be another part of what we're talking about today. But just having that sort of broad mindset, I'd like to open us up with sort of a brief question, and I'm going to be putting a link to this in the chat here. Oops, there we go. And so we've just got a quick question here to get a sense of where people are at on have you engaged with any of these tools before? And we'll have a follow-up question once we have a sense of this that'll have you go back to on which of those tools. But right now we're just trying to see, have you engaged with these tools? So in the chat, there is the link to the query, and we'll just give this another minute. And pulling this over here. So we've got a number of people who have at least tried those. Wonderful. And then the follow-up question for you all. So if you are still on that link or return to that link, there's a multiple choice question now being presented to you of which of these tools have you tried? Seeing that count coming up. All right, let's take a peek. So we've got the majority of people have at least worked with ChatGPT. We've got some, about half, who have tried the Google Gemini. A few, 20% of you have messed with some AI tools in qualitative analysis. That's wonderful. Great to see get some sense of what our familiarity might be. We'll be returning to this link in a little bit to give some feedback and thoughts later on. But thanks for giving some context to your experiences so far. So a brief aside here on AI specifically at the University of Minnesota. There is a hub of information on generative AI at the university at ai.umn.edu, where you'll find sort of news and updates as things change. I think they've got a new news notice that our current instance of Google Gemini has just updated to Gemini 3 and has new capabilities. It can create slides and do various things that the previous rendition could not. It also has some training materials, but specifically that's where we're going to find some policy ideas. The main tool that people are being pushed to, especially for a chatbot, is Google Gemini, which needs to be opted into to allow your university account to access. But otherwise, it works like ChatGPT in that it is a chatbot interface where you can upload information and engage with in different ways. There is the ability to create what's called a gem that you can give specific instructions and background documentation to, which can be useful later on as we talk about qualitative analysis if you provide it with, theoretically relevant documents and give it some clear instructions and scoping criteria, and then you can feed it different documents to work with. But the big point of why the University of Minnesota has agreements with specific tools is that there are data protection agreements built in there. And these things are not HIPAA compliant as of yet. But what they do protect against is that your data is not being retained at length for the models to be trained upon. And so the data and chat information you provided is being saved for a couple months, so you can refer back to it. It doesn't disappear immediately, but it is not being retained by the corporation to use as training and improving the model. Which is different than if you were to do some of these same tasks with ChatGPT. There are no protections from the university on that, and so anything you are putting into those windows, any documents you're updated, OpenAI, the company, can use that to continue to train the data, and that might percolate back into the conversations as things go. Notebook LM is a separate tool that that is also Google based. That needs a separate opt-in form. But what Notebook LM allows you to do is upload more supporting documents, and then it bases sort of almost all of its responses on those documents and lets you engage with them. It also allows you to create, novel creations from that. You may have seen this kind of got big play 6 to 9 months ago-ish, where if you've heard of AI podcasts and things, Notebook LM is the primary place where things like that are created, where you can provide some research articles or things of notes of interest, and then it will create a NPR style conversation between a couple individuals about that material that you can prompt and reform and adjust how you'd like them to do, or if there's a specific topic you want to focus on. It can create flashcards for students. It can create flowcharts to help you break down arguments. It's an interesting way to work through things, and we can take some time to mess with that later in the session as well. But this also is protected with our enterprise license agreement. The other things that are University of Minnesota approved are Microsoft Copilot, which was the first chatbot style thing that we had access to. It is, I would say, not quite as fancy as the Google tools, though it continues to improve and get better as well. And then you might have seen the big AI kind of button in Zoom, and that Zoom companion is also approved for university use with our data agreements and data protections with the Zoom Corporation. And I should put in the chat just so you have access to cloud. The one thing I want to note about each of these chat things is that we do need to make sure many of you might have multiple accounts with Microsoft or multiple accounts with Google. And when you're going to any of these tools, we want to be sure that you are active on your University of Minnesota credentials. And so Copilot sometimes gives you two different sign-in screens. I can't quite explain why or when or how you see either one of those, but you always want to make sure that you're choosing the work or personal account so that it's tying to your University of Minnesota credentials and our licensing and data protection. And those are those same chats. And similarly, that you're logging in with your University of Minnesota Google account rather than another one. If you're in the right spot and with the right account. If in Copilot you have this shield with a checkbox on it that tells us that you're in the enterprise data security. And if you're in Gemini or Notebook LM, you see the big bold maroon block M for University of Minnesota next to your profile. If you're missing either of those things, you are not in the data security, and either of those corporations can use what you upload to them to continue to train and improve their models. With that note out, I will open another quick set of questions on what you are hoping to do with um, generative AI in your work. And so we've got some spaces. We're going to start switching into qualitative specific information now that we've got and so I'd like to see what your hopes are. And this is a text response, so you're going to need to give me a word or a phrase that helps us understand what you are hoping to accomplish. While I'm waiting as these responses are coming in, I see a question in the chat about those graduating and leaving, perhaps you leaving the university ecosystem. For working in a more protected way, if you are continuing to do qualitative research, one of the things we'll talk about once we get to the integrations into qualitative tools is that the agreements that companies like NVivo and Atlas TI, which are technically now the same company, thanks to the magic of venture capital, they have specific agreements with their generative AI providers that your data in those softwares are not being used for training. And so there is some data protection there. Those things have not gone through the University of Minnesota lawyers review, but all their terms and service demonstrate that to be true. And so using those tools to do that gives that protection. I personally am not sure if there are ways to pay specifically to the generative AI companies for that kind of data protection as well. All right. Thank you all for your responses. We'll take a quick look here as responses are coming in. We're seeing a big focus here on data analysis, some on transcription, and we'll get to both of those things as well. Some assistance. These are great words. I'm going to ask for one more. That's again helpful for which part of this we're going to focus the most on as time continues to progress. I'll now push to the next question that'll also help guide our conversation here. That question is, what is your biggest concern or worry about using generative AI in research? And if there are other questions like Addie put in the chat that you'd like me to engage with while we're waiting for people's thoughts, I'm happy to do so. Privacy and accuracy being the big words that are coming up here. Bias, nuance. Excellent. Health and HIPAA. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. We're not there yet. Wonderful. Thank you all. All right. So those are a lot of the risks and concerns I hoped we would be hitting on, or at least considering and thinking about in our own work and thoughts, right? That we need to make sure that that this isn't making things harder because we're spending so much time preventing misinformation or disinformation or straight hallucinations from appearing in our work. And so that is a balance that takes some testing and it takes some time to figure out where you're going in there. We should be considering what kind of bias is baked in and any discrimination. Obviously, we've got the data privacy concerns and why I'm continuing to talk about the university approved tools and other institutionally approved tools to try to prevent against that. The copyright and licensing issues are still being fought with, but at least our data protection says it's not being retained by those corporations, which gives us some instance. A word I did not see, which is a hard word in qualitative work, but is that idea of reproducibility and something we should be considering, even though the gold standard of qualitative work isn't that somebody else accomplishes the same task in the same way with the same output as what we did. That is hard and or impossible to accomplish. But the idea that we're sending things into a black box, that we're not entirely sure what's coming out the other end, and if we send the same prompts, we might get a different response the second time. We likely will, because these are generative models. They're not discriminative models. They will be creating something novel each time we're asking it. And so that idea of having the consistency or transparency of process can be challenging, and it depends on how much that's important to your field, the journal you're looking for, and your research questions as well. I don't mean to sidestep the environmental costs. There seem to be increasing conversations about the relative use of a single prompt. I saw a quote that was put out by Google's team, so we're waiting for independent research, but that a prompt to Gemini costs about it was like 5 to 10 seconds of watching television, that amount of electricity. They did not talk about the water usage or how much it cost to build the model, of course, but the incremental usage is that is how they're squaring it. And so there are those kind of concerns. Does everybody have access? Are we concerned about that in research and in teaching? And what we're thinking about as far as labor and our society's ability to, change with the shifting labor and markets. So obviously a lot to engage with here. Happy if you all have thoughts, concerns, critiques in the chat there. But we should not totally sidebar these things. We could have a 2-hour conversation just about these risks and concerns, and as an attempt to be broad, we are going to leave it here, but they are real and they are difficult to grapple with. Let's shift gears now. We've done a half hour of sort of warming up. Let's get into sort of thinking about qualitative analysis itself and how we're considering that, and then pulling in where generative AI can engage. When thinking about qualitative analysis in general, I like these 4 verbs as ways of framing what we're trying to accomplish when we're analyzing qualitative materials or data. Typically, we're trying to increase comprehension or description or understanding of whatever phenomenon or behavior we're trying to understand in the study. And so that comprehension is central. We might be trying to synthesize discrete and distinct points of view to put together a more comprehensive view of that phenomenon. And so that synthesis as separate from comprehension as multiple points and the relationships between those different concepts might be the crucial contribution that we're attempting to do. We might be trying to build theory, and so that from the evidence we've collected and the grounding that we have produced, we can build theory out of that we can then go and test and search for other ways. And so that could be a main task. Or we might be engaging in more critical work where we are trying to recontextualize and restory pre-existing understanding or pre-existing power dynamic or structure and put this understanding in a new context. If these are the primary tasks we're trying to do, thinking about the types of jobs that AI can do and is good at is useful to juxtapose against. And so there is some ability for some synthesis and bringing together discrete points of information. There is some novel idea generation in the generative models that might help us with our theorizing work. Uh, that sort of synthesis and summarization work might be able to assist in some recontextualization, but there is some open tension here as well. And so we're going to come back to these kind of words as we think about some of the specific tasks in qualitative research and in that AI can actually assist with. When we're talking about data analysis, I often show this slide because it is sort of thinking about as a funneling and categorization and grouping exercise in qualitative work. And this is a place where generative AI can help us thrive, where it can put things into buckets, into categories with labels, and then we can pull on those labels to help identify those into themes and values. And so if we're thinking very mechanically about our work rather than more abstractly about what we're trying to accomplish, we can see a more direct line as to where it's possible that generative models might be assisting in doing this categorization. And so if we're thinking about that analysis, the answer, and we're asking, can these types of things be used for coding? We know that they're good at summaries. We have a good sense that there is the ability for us to engage with these chatbot, especially style things, and ask additional prompts and ask for clarification. And so we could bring that summarization more into the shape of what we're looking for. But the other hand is that these are that again, that novel generation and creation and predictive ability of putting words together is not the same as a classifying machine learning model where you've provided evidence and you're telling it how to bucket things into different places. These tools are not made to be discriminating and say this is this and that is that, and you should be classified one way or the other. They can approximate those tasks, but they're still doing it in a generative fashion. And so we need to keep that always in mind. The results might be different every time we send a prompt, and we need to think about whether that matters for the kind of work that we're doing. And something that continues to change is how well it can format its responses and how easy it is to take the content that a chat interface gives us and move it somewhere else. And that is some place that specifically Gemini has really improved in its ability to generate spreadsheets or other formatted data that we can then move into other places. It's also much better than a traditional machine learning model where one would need to write code and do computational analysis on text. We're not needing to do that kind of stuff. That's all happening in the background. It's obviously, avant-garde and in the current mindset of academics and the general public, and so that makes it enticing to do as well. We do need to concern ourselves, obviously, with privacy, with the scale, our ability to engage with all of the data we're doing and keep things consistent. And so that's going to be some of the stuff we're talking about. And how do we generate prompts that actually work with the data the way we want? So those are some of the concerns I would put out there. I'm borrowing this from Christina Silver, who's a big trainer and teacher on doing qualitative analysis, especially technologically mediated qualitative analysis. And she posits sort of a 5 primary tasks that generative AI is good at. It's good at generating things, great. It's good at that conversational model, especially sort of the chatbots. It's good at summarizing. It's good at sort of conversions, and it does a decent job at providing labels. And so she maps those sort of tasks directly onto what we can do specifically for qualitative analysis and qualitative research. So in generation, it might help us ask questions or get ideas for projects. In conversing, we can converse specifically with the data we have collected and ask the model questions about the interviews we've had, about the documents we've collected, the policy briefs, the whatever we might have gathered, we can have a conversation with those documents as if they were able to respond to us, and that can provide some usefulness, utility. That's what we're going for. In its summarization, we can reduce the amount of data we have by condensing and pulling out key arguments. And this is a place where sort of computational text analysis has been doing a good job for quite a while, summarizing and pulling main ideas out of long pieces of data. And if we can ask specific questions about that, we can really utilize that summarization ability pretty well. In conversion, that's where the transcription and translation features come in, where we're able to take a speech or an audio file and turn it into text, or take one language and turn it into another, because these models have been trained enough on those parallelization. And then where we're all looking, at least from from the words that you were sort of putting in there, is that idea that we're desiring to label and tag. And this is where honestly am the most hesitant. And we'll talk more about that sort of as we go. Dr. Silver also sort of puts the research process and maps those directly to those AI tasks. And so we can think about lots of different ways that we could converse with the model, summarize things from the model, do conversions, etc. That categorization task of data sort of directly maps onto labeling, and again is the big place where we're looking, but I'm going to argue is probably the place where we're the least certain about how this all ends up working. Are there any big questions I should address from the chat about sort of setting our stage here with qualitative research writ large or analysis writ specific? I'll talk briefly about sort of prompting, and then I'd like us to do some attempts to prompt a generative model with a piece of sample material I will provide you all. Well, actually, the NVivo Corporation has provided us that we're just going to be reusing. But that's where we're headed next. So I just want to make sure we're all still together before I move forward. All right. So working with sort of these general chatbot tools, there are a couple different ways to sort of think about starting to do this. One is to sort of, again, sidebarring the idea of using this as qualitative analysis easer, is thinking about Gemini, a Copilot, or whatnot, as your research assistant, where we can have it sort of offload some pre-analysis tasks, like summarizing papers or documents or even interviews, so that we know what the highlights are and we can quickly, find the things that we want to spend more of our time on and read more closely. We might use it to refine abstracts for conference submissions, or help it match the call for proposals to what we have already written or things we have done previously. And we could provide the call and our previous work and ask it to, find the commonalities, to find some common points there. We can use it as an editor to help us improve clarity and the conciseness of our arguments. And a place that I've also found some utility is just helping me outline what I'm going to be writing. If I provide abstracts and thoughts about where I'm going, can you provide sort of a breakdown in writing if I only have this many words? Schedule days and time blocks for working, and identifying what the tasks that I might need to do next, and sort of offloading some of that mental load of the scheduling stuff to the AI that can provide those kind of checklists for us, and plans for how we're going to go about those works. In a very specific thing, something you can try yourself, is if you've received a conference call for proposals and you have sort of a personal CV on your or list of the things that you've worked on most recently, and you don't know what you want to present for some reason, other manuscripts, you can explain, you can put both of those things into, say, Gemini, explain your role, how you're wanting to approach this, and ask it to generate a 500-word abstract that matches your work to the call that you've just received if you're looking to put something in. So just an example of how that sort of offloading research assistant kind of work might happen. But what we're really trying to think about, right, is how we engage possibly with doing this as analysis. And so let's pretend we have conducted a series of interviews about childhood mental health, and we want to analyze them based on a couple of different pre-existing theoretical understandings of how mental health works in childhood, based on other literature, etc. And so we could start with this prompt here. Please qualitatively code the following interview transcripts for evidence of the prominent theories of childhood mental health. That might be a very simple starting prompt. What do we think could possibly go wrong with if we're just starting here as our baseline? And feel free to just use the Zoom chat for this brief part. It surprisingly doesn't hurt to use polite language with the AI chatbots. Um, I think the necessity of that has lessened, but there was a time at the beginning of this where it would sometimes give better responses if you said please and thank you and like offered to bribe it, which was bizarre. Qualitatively coding being very general, absolutely. And not providing the theories directly, right? It's going to need to find those out. It doesn't tell us what we're coding for or how it's supposed to doing that. We have not specified a research question. Absolutely. Yep, these are great. These are great, great points. And so uh, all of this means we need to be much more specific in our prompt. Great feedback here in the chat. We need to provide this a higher level of context, and so we can um, be a lot more specific. One of the other things that we should be thinking about is sort of how it's going to approach the task, and this is one of the places where sort of prompt engineering doesn't hasn't updated much, right? Maybe saying please and thank you is old, and they don't care so much about that. You're not going to get much value added by saying you'll give them $1 if they do a good job in the way that you might have been able to. But it's still very useful to say, imagine you are an expert in this, have been trained by so and so, and then give a specific field or theory or framework. Uh, and as that expert, how do you, uh, and that sort of telling it to act in a certain way does change the types of outputs you get. The other thing we should include in a prompt is how we want the response to go. Unless we're just having a conversation back and forth where we're trying to be conversational, if we want an output that we can export or use in a different way, we want to be very specific to the models about what the output should look like and how we're going to be using it. So say in a comma separated list the main ideas, or using putting this into a spreadsheet with the examples and the concepts. Like you can be very specific about how you want the output to look, and that will improve your ability to take whatever it is produced and move it somewhere else. If you're thinking about this as a stepped process, like maybe you don't know what the prominent theories are. Maybe you're really going out there. Step one, identify and help me pick the theories from this field that I should apply in this situation. And the new models can do some searching. If you use Gemini, there is the deep research function, which at the university we only have 10 uses of a month, but it will take multiple minutes to do multiple levels of searching the documents it retrieves, and synthesis, and it could put that out. You could also directly state, this is the theory I want you to use. Here attached is the PDF that contains context for that. Read this document and include that as a step as well. If you have specific codes or structures or frameworks or theories that you might want to use, you could provide those examples as well. And then you should be always prepared to use follow-up questions. There are multiple frameworks for thinking about prompt engineering. I'm going to propose something generated here in the university and then bounced around a couple different trainings is sort of methods as a backronym here, where you should specify the methods and frameworks. You should ask the AI to provide an explanation or an understanding of why it has done things. See if there's any way to test back what it's provided to you. And so you could specify how you want it to do its own checking, or how it can provide information to you to do checking. You need to specify your research question here. To make the backronym work, we've used the word hypothesis, but in general, whatever theoretical context or question you have, we need to say what output we want. If we want a specific documentation of its processes or how it's gone about that, we should ask for that kind of annotation, and then make sure it is sourcing the material and showing the quotations or pieces of evidence it's using to bring that out. And so I posit to you this sort of methods backronym as a way of remembering the different parts that you should all bake into a given prompt, which might mean your prompts get very large and is one of the benefits perhaps of using a Gemini gem, where you can build some of this lengthy things in once and then just ask for additional material. And I can provide some examples of that if that would be useful. To see how this looks in practice, and this doesn't necessarily follow the methods framework I have presented here, but it follows a similar structure of a highly structured response. I have taken this prompt directly from the open source qualitative tool called Qualcoder that has a built-in ability to send things to generative AI models. And this is the prompt that it uses. You are an expert in analyzing the empirical data that was collected during the research. We could be more specific there. It's being very generic because you can also provide in this feature sort of a list of what your research questions are and your domains of expertise. The way this prompt works is that it is providing a concept and a conceptual definition already, and it's asking the model to go and find that. It is not novelly generating the codes. It is looking for the model to do some categorization tasks. So we're using this code with this definition. Please answer in the language of the code name. So use the code name, don't reframe it, and those kind of things can be useful. Here's a list of chunks of already coded data, and so you're giving the model examples of what that looks like. JSON is just a way of formatting, like a CSV or anything else, formatting data for computer tasks. And then you outline here, they outline the specific tasks that the job is supposed to do. So if you're looking at the data, estimate how relevant each piece of data is to the code I just presented. Give it a score. Interpret why and how you gave it that score, and then select a quote from that chunk that is the most relevant or has the highest score for that. And you'll get these slides later. I don't want to belabor the point by I understand there's too much text than to read in the time that I have provided. Then do all three of these steps for every chunk of empirical data, every section of the transcript, and finish that as a structured object that I can look at. Make sure that you are returning a data that I can do. And it's specifically asking for this JSON format because computationally then the software is going to parse that and put it into the tool. The point of showing this is that this is a pretty lengthy prompt that is being very explicit about the tasks that you are asking the model to complete. And yeah, just you need to be extremely detailed here. So I think I see some activity in the chat. I will be referring back to that. But if you would like, this would be a time that we could go to a chat bot of our choice. I am borrowing this from a time I spoke to graduate students about AI, and so that's why it says grad AI. I didn't change the URL here. Uh, but inside of this Google Drive folder that this link will take you to are a few documents. Ideally, I'd like you just to download the Barbara Word document that you see there, which is an interview taken from the NVivo sample data. And that sample project that the NVivo company has provided has been used in lots of sort of AI training activities across the globe, and so it is not secure. It is everybody who has participated in that has said this has been can be used for research training, yada yada yada, and so it is safe even if you don't have a data protected chatbot to attempt these things with this unsecure file. It is fine to be reused in this way. And it already has been by many people around. And so in that Z link, you will find the Barbara Word document. I invite you to go to a chatbot, attach this document, and then attempt to write a prompt that asks questions of it. Things you should know about this interview. It is with a woman who lives in the state of North Carolina in the United States, on the coast in a community called Down East, and she has been asked about her hometown, dealing with climate change, the environment, etc. And so you can just have a conversation about asking what's in the document. You can try to give a specific long list of prompts in the way that we just saw. Um, let's just sort of see what we can find playing for a minute. And I'd love for things to show up in the chat or people to unmute and ask a question if as you're spending some time playing. After, just to be clear, after we have this sort of exploration time and giving some ideas of what this looks like, um, I would ask what we're going. Sorry, we will be going into some specific AI frameworks that have been posited in the last few months about how to do this kind of analysis with prompting and sequential work with generative AI, and we'll be going over those two frameworks, and then I'll be showing what the sort of current tools are doing, NVivo, LSTI, etc., in this space before closing on transcription. But just so we don't get too stir crazy at this moment, let's take a moment to play out. You can ask it the documents any questions. You can ask what's in the document. You can write a formal thing saying, please code this for the main themes, or what emotions is the participant expressing. You can kind of play with this in whatever ways make the most sense. And that would have been a smart way of doing this as well. I forgot that I could share files directly in Zoom. Thank you, Helen, for attaching the interview document directly there. If you look in the chat, if the Z link is being fun for you for some reason, Helen has directly shared the file. My apologies for not thinking of that already. So I'm just playing here as well. Notably, in this interview file, there are different headings and sections for the main sort of framing questions that are used in the structure, and it looks like my initial Gemini response has used those structures as ways of breaking down the coding. And I cheekily asked it how I should ask it to do this better, and we have some suggestions there. And so one of the things that you will note or you might note, possibly. So I asked a question here. Does Barbara seem concerned? Is her vision hopeful? And um, it has tried to say yes and that will um, be its default sort of take on everything. It's going to agree with you and then shift that agreement. And that isn't always what you want. Sometimes you want it to directly say no. And so in your prompting, and obviously I have not written good prompts here. I was not intending to write good prompts here. I just wanted to get this going to see that we can just sort of play with this and give some things a try. In your good prompt, part of its like take on this role, you can ask it to skip on the affirmational statements, to disagree with you when necessary. Like you will find quirks in how it might be responding that you want it to not do. Bake that into the prompts at the very beginning so that it behaves differently. And that's one of the places where um, a Gemini gem can be useful. And so when I spoke of this a couple times just to give it a quick show, a Gemini gem is a named object where we describe what it should be doing, and then we give very specific instructions. You're going to behave this way, and we can then add up to 10 files that should be its background knowledge. And so we might put methodological or theoretical files into this that should be the background of how this object is operating. This will then exist as a starting point on the left-hand side where we can pull from that and then add our interviews to it. And it should operate with that same baseline set of instructions and that same baseline knowledge with the additional files we are providing toward it. I do not know if there is in this was a custom GPT in ChatGPT. Yeah, thank you, Eric, for putting that in there. Um, as far as Copilot, I forget if there is. So that is this agent idea. And so if I were to create an agent, is it going to allow me to do so? Oh, mine is just circling. I'm not sure if others are going to let you create an agent, but right now it is not allowing me. Oh, there it goes. Thank you. So there's the details, the instructions, etc. So there is your answer um, for Copilot. I and then at the bottom here is the ability to give it specific websites um, or to add. Can it create a document? I don't see a place to specifically add a file, but I have not, in obviously, I have not played with the Copilot agent. We didn't used to have access to this, so this must be a relatively speaking, again, new feature. It is hard to keep up with everything changing all of the time. I'm going to return to my slides here. All right, so some questions here that I am seeing. That image, Cassie, is impressive for one interview. I'm surprised it was so dense with content. Um, is it ethical to mention a participant's name in Gemini or other related apps? Thank you, Kaniz. So with the university's data protections, it should be okay. I'm not with the specific NVivo document that we've used. I know that it is fine to share it in whatever way it is. But in general, I would do most of my de-identification before this as good practice. You can treat, and I saw the other thing being sort of like the question about sort of IRB language around this. You're going to be treating most of this as sort of a third-party access, and so in proper AI parlance or IRB parlance, excuse me, we should be talking about de-identified data primarily. It is hard in the way that, right, with Google Drive at the university, we are not supposed to be putting identifiable information in there, even though there are some data agreements that say that they can't serve ads or do whatever with our Google Drive data. There is still the concern about the like participant data security with Google Drive, which is why the University of Minnesota has Box as the secure HIPAA, FERPA compliant storage option, right? That you can have identifiable data in. I would treat these things like Google Drive and not like Box, where we should be concerned about that. It's also why we're playing with this Barbara data where it's not as important. The data agreements do vary from place to place to a certain degree. Um, most of you do want to the main language that you're looking for if you're looking for terms of service or things like that is whether the data is retained and if it's retained for training the model. That's where things get out of hand because you don't know what's going to happen to your data after it's been ingested and if it's going to pop up in somebody else's prompt somewhere else, right? There have been previous examples of that kind of stuff happening where data that has been ingested can just show up into somebody else's prompt. And that's what the data agreements are trying to prevent against. Then there's the entire separate conversation about how much we trust these giant companies to actually be doing what they're saying they're doing, but that is slightly beside the point. All right. I'm seeing some good chats, some good thoughts and exchanges here in the chat. Feel free to keep those going. For the interest of time, I'm going to step into some of the examples that have been published in the last 3 to 4 months about case studies of people trying to develop methods of using these tools to do analysis. And then we'll do some sort of feedback on now that you've tried something and seen the frameworks, how things work. We'll talk about translation here in a moment once we get to transcription as well. Okay, so I'm going to present two different examples that are from the recent literature about how this has been done. And the first one is called guided AI thematic analysis. And it sort of sets things up in a 4-point stage. It's an adaptation of King's 2018 template form of analysis. And what you'll notice about both of these structures is that they tend towards sort of the positivist content analysis style of qualitative research, where the primary objective of what you're doing is categorizing interview responses into discrete categories and figuring out what the key examples of those discrete categories are, and that is the end of it. It is not on the interpretive end of this spectrum where we're trying to intuit deeper meaning, critique, or put in a feminist or racially informed critical scholarly lens on the documentation or on people's perspectives and experiences and bring that equity focus to light. Right? That is not the style of analysis that has been published and accepted in using these tools. It is much more we've talked to people, we need to categorize those responses so that we can characterize the data. That said, in guided AI thematic analysis, Dr. Trong puts out 4 primary steps. One in using the AI to help with data familiarization, the second to help with preliminary coding, the next to help figure out where those codes fit together in that sort of template analysis that King has talked about and refining what those are and then putting those out into broader themes. And this is taken directly from his article from this summer. And so the first step is having the AI help you with data familiarization. And what I should note is that throughout this, part of the idea is that you are going back and forth between the generative chat agent and yourself as a qualitative scholar and researcher. And you're not offloading everything to anyone. It is symbiotic in that way. And so the first thing is sort of having it summarize the transcripts or documents that you've brought in for you so you don't necessarily need to closely read the entirety of things to have a sense of what's happening in there. So the first prompt might be asking it just to give you a general summary of what's going on in a specific transcript. You then might after it provide the three main points or some phrase that takes that general summary and brings it into some specificity. And then once it has done that, and you might need to adjust and reprompt and reshape. No, go looking for this. Use this lens. Try to draw on this theory, whatever. Once you get those in the correct structure, you then provide more documentation or more data, I should say, and you ask it to do those same steps on all of the documents. And so it is an iterative process where you are improving on what the generative model is providing you, and you should be giving it feedback and critiques and those kind of things until it is something that seems sensible. And then you ask it to do it multiple times. Especially for that first part, you should have some actual familiarity with what the original transcript says so that you are confident and comfortable with the way it has summarized it and the way it has found its inherent points. The idea is that if you have that matching well, you hope that it will do whatever it has done in its black box repeatedly over the rest of the transcripts. Ideally, you are then engaging in some reflexivity throughout that part of the process and how you've needed to adjust it that you can include if you want in your methodological section. And you're going back and forth between how it is producing those highlights and summaries with what you've thought and intuited about the data already, and making sure that there is congruence between your own reflection and what the machine is telling you. Denise, I see your question there. One of the notes here is that this is just using that chatbot interface, and both of the models I'm going to be presenting are not using the legacy analysis tools. And we'll talk when we get to those tools. We'll talk about my personal opinion on either of those things. Step 2 in this process is doing some preliminary coding of that idea. And so, again, we're starting with one document first before we ask it to do things all over. And so once we've got the summary and the outline, we should have some sense of either the types of codes we might be looking for or expecting the model to present based on what the summarized data are. But in this model, you are still asking it to produce and generate the list of codes. You can imagine that there are other ways you could do this where you are providing the model the list of codes in this structure, and as they've published, they are asking the model to provide the codes. You look at that list, you decide what should stay, what should go. You make sure that apparently I have overlapping text. My apologies. You make sure what stays and goes. You make sure that you've got sort of the conceptual definitions that either you are producing or you're asking the AI to produce as well. And then once you've got that refined and defined in the way that you like, then you prompt it to apply things elsewhere. This is assuming a fairly structured interview guide. This is assuming a certain degree of uniformity across your transcriptions, that you can use one as the ideal type on which the rest of the analysis is based. Those assumptions might not be true in every research style, research question, research project. That is how what they are presenting here, however. In the third step, we then start grouping those concepts that we have now applied to everything into different clusters. We're developing sort of the subcomponents of those clusters, and we're checking for places where those things overlap. Once that is done, again, for a transcript or a set of codes, we ask it to happen to all of them. Each of those places are most likely iterative in working through things. The researcher, again, is making sure that what is being presented makes sense, that we're able to link from concepts and codes that are defined back to actual quotations in the documentation, in your interviews, in your transcripts, and that it's actually getting some of the nuance that you know, either by presenting it or from the people who ran the interviews, that that nuance is still being captured and we're not glossing over all of that. And finally, we are taking that template structure to develop our overarching themes. And we can use AI to do that, or we can skip that step and use our own mind and decision making. So that is, in a nutshell, sort of the iterative steps of this guided AI thematic analysis. A different tack on this is from David Morgan out of Portland State. And they define this as what they call query-based analysis. And rather than trying to replicate a task that was typically done in NVivo or another qualitative tool where it was manually coded and then the template and themes derived from that, what they have posited and played with a bit was doing a series of questions and answers and conversations with the chatbots to help bring out the data. And so they skipped the idea of coding and fragmenting or segmenting data altogether and just have it an iterative conversation with the AI to identify what's going on. Because it's a conversation, the human has to stay in the loop because we're not just handing things over and you're continuing to refine throughout. And they do this in a sort of series of steps as well, where you start with broad questions, get more specific, and then you actually dig down and find the examples in the data you have collected. So in the first step, you might ask different questions, whether you're trying to figure out the context, have a just sort of broad thing, or if you're looking for theory. And so we've got some prompt examples here drawn from their article. And so we might give a lot of context that we want them to look at. So these individuals, right, were engaged in this specific thing. Barbara is living in a coastal community that's undergoing climate and economic change, and they were discussing their environmental upbringing. What other themes or how did they discuss that, right? What were the key topics that came out of that conversation might be that kind of opening foray in this framework. The other thing you're going to note is that this conversational framework very much doesn't follow the prompt generation points that I put up above. It is attempting to be a lower bar conversational style, and whether that suits you or you find useful, I leave up to you all. But this is another way that people are playing with this. Once those themes are generated and in that same chat window, one of the big things to note is while we're using any of these chats, the context stays in the chat. And so the models kind of know what we've talked about before, as much as any of those words make sense. And so we need to keep that conversation going. At a certain point, we do run out of that context. And the model can't handle anymore, and we need to start a new chat, but we need to rebuild that context. And so ideally, as we're analyzing things in this framework, you're keeping things in one context so it is learning and understanding and the conversation continues. And so here we would ask for specific sub-themes to the broad topics that it is talking about, and it will try to identify those. And then we would specifically ask, all right, now give me direct quotations from the transcript we've just been discussing that demonstrate both this theme and this sub-theme. And the other tasks, it was largely summarizing, right? It was doing that summarizing task that these generative models are pretty good at. Now we are asking for it to do data retrieval, and here it is prone to creation. This is where the generative part can come into play. And so the biggest task here is to prevent against the hallucinations from seeping in. We can enhance the prompt that they've suggested by saying, please only give direct examples you can find, provide links. Gemini is very good at providing links to documents when you ask questions about them. Uh, and so that should make this flow pretty well and make that hallucination protection work a little bit better. But those are the three main, or the two main frameworks that have been sort of presented and I've seen discussed a couple times and been to a couple webinars that have talked about them. I am curious how useful these frameworks or your own explanation may have seemed to you. And so the chime in is once again open for your text response, or for a slider response, excuse me, of how does this seem like a way you want to go forward, or would you be less comfortable in this sort of chat interface and want to rely on the computational, or excuse me, the legacy coding tools, the NVivos, the LSTIs, or things that have been purpose built for this function? Seeing people chiming in here. I'll share the results here in a moment. And I did include the DOIs for both of those articles in the slides. So as you have the slides, you should be able to find and cite and read these two different frameworks for yourselves as well. All right, we'll wait one more minute for people to chime in here, and then we'll share the results and move forward. All right, so it seems that most people have found these frameworks and this sort of chat interface quite useful. We've got a pretty big um, clustering here on the very end of our spectrum. Very interesting. Before I move into the qualitative analysis tools that have been around for a while and how they've been integrating uh, these kind of features, are there any further questions or discussion we'd like to have on using those sort of chat interfaces? And the one thing we didn't really try is providing supporting documentation or theoretical or methodological citations to help build out that either in the notebook LM or in an agent or a gem or what have us. And that would be something I would recommend y'all spending some time doing at some point. And something that just did become available like within this week is the ability to sort of share out gems and collaborate on those kind of things. And so that might be something to investigate as well too. But at least at the university, that wasn't something that could be done. Mira asked a question using these kind of tools for intercoder reliability. I have seen a couple articles where um, they attempted to use, I think it was specifically ChatGPT as a second coder. Um, I haven't seen that cited a ton, but it people have attempted it. I'm not sure if that might be a model going forward or not at this point. Uh, as far as the limit to the number of documents, I believe Gem can allow 10 documents that you can upload as sort of the background, and that's with Notebook LM. I think it is a larger number than that, but I honestly am forgetting that number at this particular moment. But at Gem, I'm almost positive you can have 10 files in the background. Then you can like add documents for the analysis portion in just the normal chat interface. As far as a best platform, Gemini is doing its darndest to give ChatGPT a run for it, and this new version that at least the University of Minnesota just got access to this week seems to be quite good. Because of the data and research security concerns, I haven't used ChatGPT for research-y things in quite some time, and so I can't personally speak to how, right, I'm sure it is also improving leaps and bounds. And so it probably still has the edge, but yeah, okay. Things about data that make it less suitable. I Getting things into the same language, you put sort of translated data is useful. Um, there Yeah, in general, I think one of the biggest challenges in this space is that sort of idea, and this is sort of directly, I guess, related to your question, but not that the restraints are more methodological and theoretical than they are based on the data necessarily. Because the one thing that are unsure in either of those frameworks for analyses that we just talked through, or in just sort of our direct exploration, is the idea that of qualitative saturation, or the idea that we have gone through the data and we've made sure we've gotten the different components, and that adding additional components we're not gaining more. Or the sort of converse of that, that we've systematically and completely made sure we found every example of a certain concept across the entire corpus of our projects, of the data we've collected. And there, in sort of both of the frameworks that I presented, there are good safeguards to prevent against hallucinations, to make sure that there is sort of ideological and conceptual congruence based on what is being presented and what we actually see in the data. What we don't yet have a good solution for, and I've not seen published or presented on, is the assurance that the model has found everything, right? And it's possible that that isn't a major concern because an individual human coder might not also find everything. But we can't just assume that because a computer helped us, that we found every possible example of whatever idea that this code is representing that the model has identified in the data. Nor can we be sure that there isn't some very useful for our research question and conceptual understanding of our phenomenon or our population, that there isn't that idea that was just missed because it only showed up a couple different times and it didn't rise to the level that the model decided was most useful. Um, and that is harder to guard against, and I think is a place where people are still grappling with how do we have prevent those kind of errors of omission, rather than the hallucinations, or uh, yeah, or just sort of incongruence that might come up. We can check for that. It is harder to be sure when there's the omission. As far as best practices for AI transparency statements, as with sort of using any kind of analysis tool to aid in your organization and things, it is best to include whatever you have done in your methods section. I don't know that there is stock or formulaic language that has emerged yet because this is all so new and just starting to emerge in journal articles. Um, but it's definitely best practice to report the when and the wheres and the hows that you've used that. I have seen, right, especially in like the automated transcription, people have reported on what tool or service they use to transcribe things in footnotes and things like that for ages. And so if you're using, as we'll talk about in a few minutes here, like a transcription or translation tool, uh, citing that is no problem. If we're doing it on the analysis side, then being very clear about your engagement with the model and how much you outsourced or not is crucial. Uh, where that does fall apart a little bit is I don't know how much people have ever talked about using the legacy auto coding features in either NVivo or Atlas TI or MaxQDA or whatever that was able to do sort of very basic noun chaining and concept finding without the large language model component. I don't know how often people said they did that. Uh, but I'm going to argue transparency all day long. All right, we have half an hour. I'd like to at least show some screenshots, if not, click through some things in these tools, and then we can have more discussion as we close out. So, the various corporations that provide these qualitative data analysis tools have started to integrate generative AI models into some of the buttons and features. And NVivo's is no longer still in development. I don't know why I didn't delete that bullet point. I apologize straight off the bat. But both Atlas TI and NVivo have buttons that allow you to summarize either codes that you've created or documents that you've brought in. Deduce has explicitly not included any generative AI in their model, which I find slightly wild, given it is all online and all cloud-based. But as far as I am aware, there is no generative AI integration at all in Deduce. And I was just on their website yesterday trying to find, and so I'm almost 100% positive there, unless they're not advertising it, which would be odd. But Atlas TI has the ability to summarize. It has the ability to generate codes or tags and apply those throughout the documents. It has the ability to use what it calls intentional coding, where you can provide a research question, theoretical framework, and guide so for it to go out and code. And it provides the conversational chat window within it. And so for those of you that are not in a unit or an organization that has data security protection, Atlas TI has taken care of that with OpenAI. And so the same kind of assurance that whatever you are putting in via Atlas is not being used by OpenAI to train their data that we have with Gemini and Copilot as the University of Minnesota and the units that have that. Those places don't have, or these places cannot use your data for training. MaxQDA has that similar battery of features, and NVivo focuses on summarization. I apologize, I pulled the wrong slide in here. Summarization, but it also has the ability to generate what it calls child codes. And so you can provide base coding and it will provide sort of the different flavors of that concept within the concept you've already created. It isn't set up to do the novel new coding in the same way. The open source tool QualCoder has the way it is mainly integrating OpenAI or generative AI features is the ability to find more examples of a certain code that you've identified. And so it'll take examples that you provided and then go look in the rest of your transcripts for examples of that. There are a whole new generation of AI tools or qualitative analysis tools that are built with AI in mind. The two that I have seen commented on or discussed the most, at least in my circles, are Q Insights and Reveal, which is now called Do Reveal. They must have had some naming issues at some point. Dr. Susan Fries has been large in AI training or excuse me, qualitative analysis training and the use of software for some time now. And so her company, Qualudra, I'm pronouncing everything wrong today, has produced this new tool called Q Insights, where you can choose from four different types of qualitative analysis or qualitative adjacent analysis that will use generative models in the background. What this definitely provides is that assurance that things are grounded in the information. And Do Reveal has a lot of sort of quick buttons and quick generated charts based on those things. There are a ton more, though, that I have not had time or funding to mess with a ton. Delve is another one that seems very qualitative analysis tool adjacent, and it advertises itself as rigorous like the other tools, MaxUDA, NVivo, Atlas TI, without the same learning curve because generative AI is doing a lot of the coding. Kantar takes that same kind of thing and just sort of says it will help you scale things up. There are two tools that also do AI or a few different tools, Diaform, FlowRes, and ALIs that have generative AI avatar interviewers. So also have generative AI run your interview protocols. And I have, I don't know, personal ick feelings about that, but it might be useful for certain kinds of data collection, again, to scale things up and to have those structures. And so Diaform, FlowRes, and ALIs all do that. Coloop is another big one that I've seen up and rising. MyRA, Dovetail, and Outset. Dovetail and Outset are both mainly for like corporate feedback surveys and actually doing something with those open-ended responses that people at companies have been ignoring for ages. And so that's what those are mainly for, but they are also in this general space. All of this is to say that there are going to be more and more companies trying to capture different parts of this market. I am old school enough that I am going to trust the tools that have done this for a long time with some theoretical and methodological rigor and focus to do these kind of tasks better than a company that's trying to cash in on a new craze. But that is also my personal editorial comments. These things all do exist, and we'll see if they end up taking hold at all in the academic sphere. Uh, yeah. I just wanted to point those out. A couple different screenshots for some examples, and I'm happy to jump into any of these tools if that would be useful for you all to sort of see what this kind of stuff might be looking at. And so in Atlas TI, if you ask it to look at all of your documents at once, it will give you lists of codes that it has found. And something you will notice here is that it's going to be many. And every time I have attempted to use these automated coding features that are now generative AI based, I get more codes than I could ever use. And here you can see it created 123 codes based on 100, it says 138 documents. Most of those documents, because it's Atlas TI, were actually survey responses. And so it was one survey of 100 responses with 38 other documents in there. And that's quite simply just too many concepts. And that is what it's going to sort of head towards. You can also have conversations. And so here I'm using that same Barbara document, and I've got screenshots of my quick conversations about her concerns. And the delightful way that this framework, because it's based on a qualitative analysis tool rather than a general purpose chatbot kind of tool, is that it gives us the direct quotations immediately. I don't need to ask for that as a secondary part. It knows that I want to have the grounding of any of the claims I'm going to be qualitatively making. And so as I have a conversation, it's always going to ground the responses with the data. With intentional coding, it gives us a window that looks something like this, where we can specifically define our research goals, our questions, and it gives a couple example buttons that will pre-populate portions of that, and then go and give me that same coding window, just hopefully with this in the background. Uh, I have not found it to uh, improve the overabundance of codes. It still has that issue where there are just too many different small categories rather than there being sort of a cohesive whole being presented. And that was an accidental double accident. I don't know why that duplicated. In NVivo, the one thing I didn't show on the LSTI side is the summarization feature, which you'll press a button and it'll give you a paragraph long summary of whatever you're looking for. In NVivo, when you ask the AI assistant to summarize some text, you can specifically ask for segments of a document or the entirety of the document. When you ask for summaries of segments, something that is useful is it will try to convert colloquialisms or interesting turns of phrase that maybe you don't have a strong handle on, or expert talk, into something that's a little bit more, you know, uh, digestible. Um, and so here, right, the example is demonstrating that the person said that they are a dingbatter, and that means that they are a generational descendant that has their family has and their family's family has been in this community for a long time. You can specify the length and those kind of things of the summaries it provides as well. You can summarize entire documents, and you can have it suggest child codes. It is it is built, and I sat on the advisory committee with NVivo for some of these trial and errors on this features. It is built to prevent you from using it as the first cut of analysis to try to demonstrate and indicate that you should be doing the first coding. It is possible, however, for you to just create a code for the entirety of a document and then ask for subcodes, and it will just code the entirety of that document. And you can decide whether or not that is useful or not. It will give you, as it suggests, the different concepts, sort of the quotation, so you're sure of that finding throughout your document. And so these are sort of baked in, doing a lot of that prompt generation and iterative nature of prompting that we talked about in the beginning half of this that you can accomplish in a general chat window. And it's all of that's happening behind the scenes in a proprietary way that we're unsure exactly how they're phrasing their prompts, and that's part of their secret sauce. And so that is all happening back there. It is still the foundation of how this works, but we don't exactly know how they phrased those queries into the concepts. This is separate from the general auto coding or theme identification that most of these tools already had, where it was essentially finding nouns or things that have been named and pulling those out for us. And that's all I'm demonstrating here. And so it is better than this, but it is still, there are still many, many codes that are being provided. Qualcoder work in this open source tool works in an interesting way, and where it downloads a small language model onto your personal machine to understand the data, so that not everything you are sending to the AI is identifiable or identifying. And so it sort of chunks the data in an interesting way, so that as you are interacting with a chatbot model and it's doing that prompting for you in the background, hopefully your participant data is slightly more secure, is the general idea behind that. And again, it's assuming you've done some coding and then you are searching for more examples of those concepts throughout. And it will try to give you, right when we mouse over something, and this is something that neither Atlas TI nor NVivo do, which I find slightly disappointing, but it gives you kind of its guess at how relevant it is in that scoring feature and some sort of justification for why this has been included. Again, trying to help you not have hallucinations or things that don't make sense show up in your data. It still doesn't solve the issue of omission. All right. Are there questions about the tools or desire to see specific parts of it? I'm going to talk for 5 to 10 minutes about, or probably 5 minutes about transcription. We've got 15 minutes of group conversation in the chat, or question and answer for me, or I can jump into some of these things as well if this is the better time than the transcription. So it's kind of what's most useful for you all at this point. Or we can have more time to play around and share our thoughts in the chat bots too. I see a couple questions in the chat that I might as well address here before we jump into the transcription part. Um, One on Ruth's question, conducting analysis on two different AI platforms for reliability. I have not seen that done. I would be hesitant given that even conducting the same analysis on the same AI platform, you're likely to get an unreliable result because of the generative nature of the models. The summaries are going to look slightly different. The ways that it's going to phrase and frame concepts and codes is going to definitely be different. Uh, and and so there is just that uncertainty and baked into using these kinds of tools. We are not yet at the place where if I go back to GPT and give it the same prompt with the same data, it's not going to give me the same result. There is something in the background of any of these chat models called temperature, which is how creative and human-like it's trying to be. And so in some of the ways, I think in the custom GPTs, you might even have a slider where you can turn your temperature all the way down. So it's a little bit more determinative in that it's going to do a similar process every time and hopefully give you a more similar result every time. You can also sort of put that into the prompt and ask it to turn down the temperature. I don't know how effective that is as opposed to like actually being able to touch the model and say, no, I want less. But that I have some discomfort on the analysis side with that unreliability and that generative stochasticity of how things are slightly different every time we go about it. I envision the scene from Jurassic Park and Malcolm's hand dropping the water droplet and like the chaos theory of it's always going to be slightly different is just stuck in my millennial brain. But I'm slightly disconcerted there. Others are obviously less disconcerted and are trying it and using it. And so you don't need to let my hesitation guide the day there. As far as resources about making sense of auto coding, there are sort of documentation on both Atlas TI and NVivo and Max QDA about how they set up their auto coding procedures, their generative AI integrations that kind of outline the general thoughts behind them and what they're doing. As far as then on the other end of like making use of those, they don't provide that kind of documentation, and I've not seen any like direct training materials necessarily on that. Let's switch to transcription, then we'll see what other questions and answers we can still engage with here as the time goes on. OpenAI has provided something called Whisper, which is a speech to text language model, and it has provided that for free. And so what that means is that the whole model can be downloaded to a personal or university computer and housed and run there. Depending on the size, there are different scales of how complex this language model is. Can take up to 1 to 2 GB of storage space to store the model on your hard drive. What's beneficial about that is that you can run it locally or run it on a secure university machine, and you know that your private identifiable audio or video file is not being sent to some third party that you need to get IRB review for or need to get some kind of data privacy statement about. You are downloading the model, you are running it in that secure location, and it is not touching the internet again. And the other beneficial part is that language models are hard to use. And so because it has been provided freely, there are a number of free graphic user interface software options that allow us to interact with that without needing to know anything about it other than please transcribe this for me. And so outside of the sort of Zoom transcription service, it is the best free option I have seen for this kind of material, and a place where I know has been a pain point for myself and for people who I have worked with, trying to get the recordings into something that can be textually analyzed in any kind of way. This model is also trained on doing translations from many, many languages. When you find there is a list, if you go to OpenAI's Whisper or any of these tools, you'll see sort of drop-down lists for their menus. There are languages that are missing. I know, for instance, there a lot of people are studying, migrant communities in this Minneapolis St. Paul area, and from what I remember, like Karen is not on the list of languages that it is familiar with. And similarly, there are some like Horn of Africa, East Africa languages that it is not familiar with. And so those languages that might come up in our local studies might not be there, but it can do Spanish to English, and it can do some of the other broader, more widely globally used languages. Certain versions of this can do what is called in the computer science parlance diarization, but what we would typically just call speaker identification and knowing when one person stops talking and another person starts talking. This is the part where it is least effective. It is still pretty good, but when you are reviewing any transcription that this model will create for you, that is the part where I have found the most need to do revisions. Any kind of automated transcription is going to be reliant on the clarity of the speaker's diction, on the clarity of the recording quality, and so it can struggle with certain accents and dialects depending on the language. And so if it's worth a try, but for some people it's going to work very accurately, and others it's going to get you, 75% of the way there and still need some manual zhuzhing to make it work better. There are a number of different sort of interfaces that make this work. There is a web app that one can download and then run it, just run in your browser, that you can download off of the open website Hugging Face, which shares open generative models, large language, small language models, and their implementations. And so you could download that and run it in your browser. An app that is found in the Microsoft app or the Apple App Store is called Buzz or Buzz Captions. And the App Store version costs $10, or you can download it for free directly off of GitHub by searching Buzz Captions and GitHub, and you can download it for free. It's got a few fewer features than the downloaded version. It is also functional in Windows, and you can see what the output ends up looking like. It gives me timestamps. It gives me sort of each individual phrase that's identified. They do take some cleaning. It's not going to be a beautiful transcription coming out to you, just because they aren't quite good enough to like make paragraphs that are sensible quite yet. But it does get the words that were said from audio to textual. The one I would actually recommend, however, is called A-Train. I used to only be able to recommend this for Windows computers, but they just finally released a beta version for Mac. It is freely available. If you're on a Windows machine, you can download it from the Microsoft Store directly for free on your Windows machine, or you can go to the internet and Google A-Train transcription, not to be confused with the comic book character. But the Mac beta version is only available directly from the internet website. What I like about this is that there's a clarity and cleanliness to its interface. We can automatically let the tool know if there are more speakers and how many. We can tell it what language it is and whether we want it transcribed into English or translated, excuse me, into English. And some of those things are possible, but a little bit less clear in the Buzz interface. But all these tools can do multiple languages, can turn things into English or another language if you need it to, and identify speakers. When we do A-Train, it gives us multiple different forms of this output depending on what tool you're going to be feeding it into. And so this is the timestamped version where we have this timestamp with the speaker identification and things like this. But you can see that it didn't quite get where the speaker change happened here, right? The interviewer and the interviewee transitioned somewhere in the middle of this sentence. I forget based on this example if it was on the let's dive into it or the okay, well, I think it was on the okay, well, let's start off, right? And so the beginning part of that sentence, it attributed to the wrong speaker. And those kind of things do happen a lot. And similarly, we see this with the yeah, I'm currently a graduate student. And so we would need to move that down. And so looking at those liminal moments where a speaker transition happens is going to be the main point of data cleaning. So those are the things I wanted to get across and to talk about and to put out there. I know it's a lot to think about. There are a lot of moving pieces, and there's going to be differing applicability for the kind of research and the kind of analysis you are trying to do. But I'm happy to be a resource. I'm happy to engage more fully on this as things go.